If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, drivers, outdoors people, etc., have you ever had any humanoid, cryptid, entity, or creature sightings out there? If so, tell us your stories. I ran around my neighborhood at 3 a.m. with my friends in middle school. We were ducking around outside when we heard a cop car come flying up with its lights on. We dove into some woods to hide, and the cop car slowed down, put on its searchlight, and scanned the woods. We stood stone still, the four of us, until the cop passed. Then, all of a sudden, one of my friends sprints between us, off deeper into the woods. What the duck? We start whispering to each other, trying to figure out which one of us had just run off. We walk out of the woods and realize that we were all there. Someone else had been hiding in the woods with us. I was visiting my grandparents in a nice little village in the mountains. There are maybe 1,000 inhabitants, houses are within walking distance of each other, and there's absolutely no light anywhere. So, I went to my cousin to hang out, 20 minutes walking distance, and stayed there until maybe 1 a.m. It was a really dark night, there was no moonlight, so I could barely see the road. As I approached the house, I heard something in the bushes near me, but I ignored it at first. Then I heard it again, this time louder, and I stopped in my tracks. Something started growling somewhere in front of me, and all I could see was a large, dark thing, probably a huge dog. Shit, there's no one there, absolute darkness, just me and this thing in front of me. I had nothing on me. So I started yelling and waving my hands in the air to make myself look bigger or scarier, I guess. The growling intensified, and just when I thought I was going to get attacked, it stopped and disappeared. This was all at a time when we had no smartphones, so no light source whatsoever. I was driving up to New Hampshire to visit my grandmother over the weekend. If anyone knows the roads up north, they're beautiful but very long and lonely. It's cold out, nighttime with no moon, and all I have is the hum of the motor to keep me company. I wasn't really speeding, maybe I was doing 10 over the limit. All of a sudden I see flashing lights from a police cruiser appear behind me, which was weird being they just all of a sudden appeared with no headlights or anything. I put my signal on to let the officer know I'm pulling over. I put the car in park and wait for the officer to approach my car, except for one thing. The police cruiser was gone. Nothing passed me, I know that for sure. I open the door and get out on this long, quiet road, and I'm greeted with nothing but dead silence and darkness. I immediately jump back in my car and take off. I was camping with my Boy Scout troop in Alpine, New Jersey when I was in the early 8th grade, November of 2010, I stepped out of the cabin in the middle of the night to take a piss and went out and did my business. I stood outside for a second, taking in the campsite. I was standing by a picnic table and glanced around. The moon was so bright that it made the sky look dark blue rather than black, and there was a light fog ominously cascading along the campsite. I heard rustling in some bushes and didn't think much of it at first. But it continued and got louder. Slowly, I moved my flashlight along until I got to the source of the noise, as it got louder and louder. I looked over and saw something that I still don't quite understand, to be honest. This thing was gigantic. Standing on hind legs, he was tall and had a muscular body with fur that looked to be black or dark gray. He had the head of a dog or wolf, only thicker. And the weirdest part? Yellow eyes. I stared at him, and he stared at me, and then he just vanished. I ran away faster than I could even blink. I was so bewildered that I blacked out for a minute and had to sit down, but I went back to the cabin and tried to go back to sleep. I managed to block it out of my mind for a while. Repressed memories is the term, I believe, but it eventually resurfaced when I watched an episode of Monster Quest about werewolves. I was driving home last night at around 1 a.m. It was already a full moon, so I was on high alert for any animals that might cross my path as I drove through a very rural area that is mostly dense forest on either side of the road for miles. Anyway, as I was turning a corner, a deer jumped out in front of me. I slammed my brakes and honked my horn. The deer ran into the forest on the opposite side of the road, and I sped up, rounding the corner. That was when freaking SHT started happening. A tall, white figure was standing at the edge of the woods. I didn't get a good look at it because looking at it felt wrong, and I sped up, but it had a human shape besides being about 9 feet tall. I couldn't make out a face, but it was glowing slightly. After that, I sped up, hoping to get home as fast as possible, and the whole way home, after that incident, my car was making weird noises and my radio had much more static than usual. A warden for Wisconsin's Department for Natural Resources, DNS, was driving up State Highway 13 just south of Medford one day in the mid-1990s when he caught sight of something that he wasn't taught how to deal with. Standing in the middle of the road was a figure the size of a man, resembling a reptilian humanoid covered in green scales. In a moment of either bravery or stupidity, the warden kept driving towards the entity and got close enough to nearly hit it before it unfurled a pair of wings that had previously been folded up, hidden on its back. It swiftly shot upwards and over the warden's car. However, it wasn't done playing with the witness yet, as it then landed on the road behind the car. This time, the warden didn't wait to see what would happen next. Obviously, this encounter could be chalked up to a hallucination by a tired and road-weary warden, if only a truck full of highway employees didn't see the same creature near the exact same spot on the road, not long after the first sighting. Once again, the anomalous reptilian spread its leathery wings and took flight as the men approached, this time vanishing into a nearby copse of trees. So about a month ago, I was headed home from work around midnight. I exited the highway to get on this 28-mile stretch of highway. I could see police lights. As I passed the cops at around 60 miles per hour, I speeded up to my normal 80 miles per hour. I drove about 5 miles, and I could see a blinking orange light. As I approached it, the light was blinking on some kind of shopping cart or stroller. I looked up to see who the duck was pushing the cart way out in the middle of nowhere at midnight. The face reminded me of the girl from The Exorcism. Maybe I was going too fast, but that face, it was miles away from those cops and anything else. Plus, it was over 100 degrees outside. Today, my wife tells me she is on her way home this morning at 6 a.m. She was looking at the roadkill, just telling herself that they didn't look like the normal coyotes, they were smaller and gray. Well, she said, as she passed the third road, a little bright white person was frozen. It was as if it was trying to not be seen. When she noticed that she saw it, it leapt back into the bushes and disappeared. She said it was white, like a paper white humanoid as tall as one of our daughter's dolls. About 6 inches, and it was blurry. I've always felt weird on that highway. I could fill in the deaths of the natives that once lived there, but now I'm thinking there's a portal. Time has just always been weird when driving that highway. This sighting happened in the winter of 2005. My best friend and I were on our way home, after visiting friends, in Hickman, Kentucky, so we're driving down the highway between Hickman and Union City, TN, and as soon as we get into Union City, we see something running across the road. It was dark gray in color and about the size of a big German shepherd. It looked like a wolf with very yellow eyes. The wolf wasn't running fast, and it looked at us while running across the road. It ran right to left into an open field, and that was it. We were both like, what was that? We weren't scared, we were just puzzled, trying to figure out what it was. I know what a coyote looks like, so that was out of the question. It didn't feel like we were seeing a normal animal. So this happened when I was about 5 or 6 years old. I am 21 now and I live in South America. It was nighttime, I was with my mom and dad, and I think we were just leaving from my grandma's house. So my dad was driving, and I was just looking through the car window, looking at random things like the sky, trees, etc., but then suddenly something huge caught my eye. We were just passing by a small house at that moment, and in front of the house was this huge white, slender humanoid thing. It was almost as big as the house. The house is roughly around 20 feet. It almost looked like it was trying to climb on the house. When I saw it, I wasn't really scared of it. I was actually more interested in what it was. After that, I literally remember nothing else. I don't remember when I really asked my dad about it, but I am sure I told him about it at one point, because he always brings it up when he talks about spooky stuff with family. So one time, during one of these conversations, I asked him what he thought it was. He told me it could be a liba, which is basically a spirit of the woods that takes the form of a giant. He told me these things are huge, and sometimes their legs are mistaken for trees. My uncle, who is a hunter, says he also found huge footprints when he was out hunting in the woods. So yeah, that was my strange encounter. I live in the suburbs outside of Chicago. These events took place near a major road in a rural section of the town. 2 nights ago, around 9 p.m., I was driving home with my girlfriend. We were talking about a TV show we both enjoyed and just making general small talk. Near my house, there is a certain road that just always makes me feel extremely uncomfortable. The road has no street lights and is hard to see. All of the lights from the surrounding area seem to be drowned out due to how densely wooded the area is. Accompanying the array of trees are some small houses. Most of them are in states of disrepair, and a number of them are vacant. With this area being kind of chill at night, I always turn my high beams on when I drive down there. As we are about halfway down the road, I notice something dark from the edge of the road into some hedges. What I saw wasn't exactly pleasant to look at, even with my limited view. My headlights illuminated the bottom half of the creature, due to it being fairly tall and fairly down the road. Due to this, I couldn't see the whole thing, but of what I did see, I remember vividly. The creature was gangling. It was about 6 to 7 feet tall and looked to be starved. I could make out its ribs underneath its tight skin. Its fur was very short, like that of an otter, and covered all of what I could see. Its knees were pointed backwards, sort of like a bird's, and its feet seemed to be pawed like a dog, but they were massive. Even more horrifying were its long, skinny arms. I couldn't see its hands, but just from seeing those arms, I didn't, and still don't, want to know what was attached to those things. From looking at its hips, I could tell that it walked either upright or something very similar to that. Its back was at a 45-degree angle to its legs, but it was curved instead of straight. The way it ran was like a person over-exaggerating a tiptoe. This creature was less like one animal and more like a conglomerate of many others. When I saw this thing, I went silent. I didn't know what to do, so I just kept silent and kept driving. I looked back in my rearview mirrors, but only darkness looked back. I couldn't see anything. My girlfriend could see that I was visibly shaken and aloof in the conversation. Apparently, she didn't notice whatever the hell that thing was and didn't know why I was acting so odd. At first, she didn't believe me, but as I gave more and more detail while showing more and more fear, she knew I was telling the truth. I was understandably uneasy for the rest of the night. When I told my account to one of my friends who lived in the area, he reminded me of an event that took place just back in August. One street over from my sighting, there was a bloodied and skinned animal on the side of the road. We both drove by it a few times because it was there for a few days. Whatever that poor animal was, we didn't know. It was too badly mangled to be recognized. We think that the animal might have been a raccoon or a dog. Hopefully, these two events are unrelated. Around 10 years ago, I was visiting my dad and extended family in North Carolina. I went to a party with my cousin but was left alone because he and some friends were going to another party. On the way back to my dad's house, there is a swamp on the side of the road. Over the years, many family members claim to have seen weird things in that swamp. Even my dear, deceased grandfather swore he saw a dog turn into a horse there while fishing before I was born. In the early 1900s, there was a satanic church there that the community burned down. Back to the story. As I drive by the swamp, I see what I think is an older woman with a dark blue or black cloak on. She is facing the swamp. This is roughly 30 feet from the road. In my mind, I'm thinking she is praying for someone, as she appears to have both arms folded in front of her as I'm viewing her from her back. But I'm thinking, why would someone be praying in almost complete darkness at 2 a.m.? This is summer, and I pull over and yell at the woman, asking her if she is okay. She immediately swiveled, not turned around, like she was being quickly spun around. I see a hood on its head, but the face area is pitch black. She is gliding fast towards my car. And I mean fast. Not walking or running, but gliding. I had a Jeep with an open roof, and as I spun off, I kept waving my hand behind me to make sure whatever it was didn't jump in my Jeep. After a mile or so, I get the courage to slow down and look back, but I don't see anyone. When I got to my dad's house, one of my uncles was also there. I wake them both up and tell them what I saw. My uncle says, "Stop bothering me, city boy, so you finally saw something. We all see crazy things back here." It was probably a haint, which in down south drawl. I told all my aunts, uncles, and family, and all of them said yes, I probably saw something, but all of them wrote it off to something evil and told me these things happen all the time down there. Between Monticello and Moab, Utah time, pre-dawn summary, driving on Highway 191, a couple had pulled off to the side of the road after arguing briefly. They were at the County Road 46 intersection, and it was still a bit dark, but the sky was getting brighter. She stayed in the car while her boyfriend stepped out of the truck to get some fresh air. As he was about to finish, he took a quick glance at the road behind them and noticed in the distance, a little less than a mile, a figure on the side of the road hobbling as it walked towards the truck. This surprised him in that they hadn't seen or passed a person since they left Monticello. As he stood there, he realized it grew in size, meaning that it approached at incredible speed. Backing up, he yelled at his girlfriend, "Get ready to leave fast." At a dead sprint, he ran into his truck and jumped into the passenger side, only to find himself screaming at the top of his lungs at his girlfriend, instructing her to go. 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 Slamming his door, he took one glance back outside his window as the truck peeled off and saw what he said could only be described as the most mangy-looking human or animal he had ever seen. He couldn't tell if it was in rags or just a heavy-coated black animal running or hobbling very fast, as it did quickly catch up to the side of his truck. According to him, the way the eyes looked struck him with terror. They were very large, almost bulging out as would as praying mantis's eyeballs, but with pinpoint pupils. Too afraid, he looked away from his wife, who was starting to shake uncontrollably. He took the steering wheel, realizing she also took a glance at this thing, her foot still flooring the accelerator. Trying to calm her down, he maintained a firm grip on the steering wheel for a good 2 minutes, finally looking over his shoulders outside the truck and seeing nothing. Half an hour later, they were driving into the city limits of Moab, Utah. This is going back several years and happened in southeast Queensland, Australia. We were having dinner in our car in front of the water near the bay. It must have been around 9 p.m. Just an ordinary night, we'd both not long finished work. I remember eating my food and suddenly having this horrible feeling, you know, when you just know something is terribly off, kind of like when you are having sleep paralysis, that feeling of dread. My heart is beating in my throat, my stomach sinks, and I can't stomach my food. With no time to mention any of this, my partner is basically panicking and saying, "Go, go. Get us the duck out of here." On top of my gut feeling, no questions were asked, I just hightailed it out of there. The whole drive home, it felt like something was right on our tail, chasing us. My partner was in hysterics and didn't want to talk about it. When she finally calmed down, she said she had seen a tall, pale white being emerge on the bank in front of our car, which must have been several feet tall. When she tried to explain its eyes, she would break down again. It had this look like it knew everything about us. It was like looking into her mind or something. I asked if she could draw a picture, but she refused. Asking about this years later led to her shutting down or not wanting to talk about it. It left us both shaken. To this day, I have no idea what that was all about. I was visiting family in the US when I was a kid. We were on a 3-hour drive in the middle of nowhere in Pennsylvania. I had to take a piss really badly. My dad eventually pulled the car over so I could go piss in the woods. It was like 11 in the morning. I went far off the road into the woods because I didn't want anyone to see me. I wound up being completely out of sight of my family and the road itself. I start taking a piss next to this large rock. I notice up ahead that there are these 3 figures digging around in the dirt. At first, I was like, damn, these people will see me, so I continued to finish with pissing as soon as I could. As I kept an eye on them, I noticed that they definitely weren't humans. They seemed to be in suits, however, they also looked naked. At this point, I thought, duck this, I'm getting out of here. I quietly slipped away from the rock and ran back to the road and my family's car. A few years later, I was watching Unsolved Mysteries, and there was an episode that had the classic gray type of alien, and it looked exactly like the things I saw. I'm a truck driver, and I was heading east on I-80 up through Illinois. I had stayed the night, the afternoon, in Des Moines to get some sleep, and I got a fresh 8 hours of sleep, and I had just gotten on the road. It was about dusk, the sun was just about to set, and I was driving when I saw a figure just ahead of me on I-80, and it was right on the side of the road. When I say right on the side of the road, I don't mean in the grass. Its toes were right on the white line. I slowed down a little bit to kind of see what was going on there and maybe avoid it. When I got about 50 yards from it, I got down to about 50 miles per hour, and I could see it clearly. I had my brights on and everything. It was a man. Well, it looked like a man, maybe 5 feet 9 inches or 5 feet 10 inches. It couldn't have been more than 100 pounds soaking wet. And when I got up to him, he looked at me and George. I kid you not, he had no eyes, no mouth, and no nostrils. There was no orifice on his face. He was pale white. No hair. There are no features whatsoever. It looked like a skeleton with bleached white skin. He was just kind of standing there, looking right at me. I slowed down, and as soon as I saw his face, he looked up at me. Boy, I flipped the hammer down from Illinois all the way to Chicago. I never looked back. My blood ran cold. My hair stood up. It was one of the most disturbing things I've ever seen in my life. Springtime in southern Utah, or Colorado. Near Arches National Park around 1999. I was traveling with my family, and I was about 6 years old. We had been driving for a while after a full day of hiking. We arrived at a gas station with picnic tables on the left side of the building. We just bought bread, sliced meat, and chips for dinner, the 7 to 11 special, as my father called it. After we ate, my parents went to chart our route in the car, the days before GPS. Me, my sister, and my brother sat at the table finishing our meals when a young Native American boy approached us. He must have been about 12 or 13 years old, and since it was dark, he seemed to just appear out of nowhere. He greeted us and asked if he could sit with us. We obliged, and my sister did most of the talking, being the oldest. That was when he asked us if we had heard of skinwalkers. The name itself was disconcerting. He described them to us. They look like people and can change shapes. They can be animals or old people. But if you let them near you, they will eat you. I was the youngest of the three, so I was usually the only one who knew the joke, but I could see fear in both my brother and sister, and that scared me. The boy left with a smooth exit after accomplishing his goal of frightening the white tourists. When we told our parents, they insisted he was just scaring us, but my father chimes in. It's a real myth, though, the skinwalkers. The Navajo said they were tricksters and witches who changed form. They usually show up as elderly people or animals, but that's not true, like aliens or something. My mom hit my dad's arm, knowing he helped the young boys by frightening us. We kids believed in aliens. It was spooky, but we moved on. This is where it gets a little strange. The next day, we were driving, and there was a car stopped in front of us. They were stopped by a deer standing in the middle of the road. We all got out and were just looking at the deer just standing there. I pulled up my camera to take a photo, but when I looked through the lens, nothing was there, just the road. I looked back, there was the deer slowly blinking and flapping its ears. I could hear its breath, but I'd look through the camera, and it'd be gone. It's possible I'm remembering wrong, but I'm an adult now, and I'll never forget that feeling of seeing nothing when something was there. Me and some friends went camping in a field next to a forest in the middle of nowhere. It started getting dark, so we lit a fire and everything and were all sitting around it, and I could see someone moving along the ridge of a hill about 200 feet away from us, just walking straight across in the darkness, at about 9 p.m. at night. I thought this was a bit weird, and maybe it was like a police officer or something about to tell us to leave, but they just carried on walking straight past and eventually disappeared over the edge of the ridge when I stopped seeing movement. Then me and some of the group went to get some old sticks and stuff for firewood from just inside the forest, so we walked about 10 feet in, and I started to hear this very heavy breathing from behind me. I turned around, and there was nothing there except the noise of really heavy breathing, like someone panting. The guy next to me heard it and turned around with the torch, still nothing, but we were both really freaked out and just watched for ages, and although we couldn't make out any solid shapes because the forest was too dense, we could see something moving around between the trees, getting further and further away, with the heavy breathing leaving with it. So we did the only thing we could think to do and legged it back to the tents. I had just turned 22, and my parents had sold their house and purchased a place out in the country. On the property, there was a big shed not far from the house that I decided to turn into my place. Now, I felt kind of uncomfortable in the shed sometimes, but my dog kept me company, so it wasn't so bad. Anyway, I had been in there for maybe 2 weeks, and one night I'm on the computer, my dog is asleep at my feet, and I need to pee, so I get up and go outside to piss. It's a beautiful, clear night, and the stars were incredible. The next thing I hear, the shed door slams behind me. I turn immediately and try to open it, but it won't budge. Now, from inside the shed, I can hear my dog start to growl, quietly at first, then louder. Now he's barking, and I'm panicking trying to get the door open. I must mention that I'm 6'5" and well built, I play sports, etc., but even ramming my full weight into the door won't open it, and I'm really panicking now as my dog's bark turns into whines, then whimpering, then silence, and with all my might, I slam into the door and it flies open. The light is off inside now, and it's pitch black, it won't turn back on, and I'm in complete darkness. I can't see my dog anywhere, and I stumble around trying to find a torch. Finally, I find it, pick it up, and turn on my torch. I wasn't prepared for what I'd see next. My dog had literally squashed itself into the furthest, darkest corner of the room, eyes closed, and was shaking violently. I immediately moved towards him, and as soon as I got within reach of him, he leapt at me into my arms and wouldn't move. I picked him up, and I swear, I've never run so fast in my goddamn life. I never stepped foot in that shed ever again, and my dog wouldn't even go near that part of the property. I don't know what happened in that shed that night, but I'll never forget it. I was driving home late one night. Somewhere between 1 and 3 a.m. the stretch of road I was driving goes through the back end of a couple of counties in the deep south. Nothing around but forests, fields, and the occasional group of shacks huddling under a light that only barely keeps away the night. I'd driven this stretch of road many times before, even at this time of night, so it wasn't really a big deal. It was just a long trip. Since there was rarely any traffic that time of night, during the day you could always count on at least a handful of cars somewhere around, I was able to turn the stereo up and push the pedal down. And then I came to this bridge. There's nothing really noteworthy about it, it's not ancient, a covered bridge, or all that spooky. Just a concrete span over swampland, trees growing right up near the edge and turning the road into a dim trail at the bottom of a dark canyon. I'd been over this bridge many times before, and aside from being fairly long, it wasn't really noteworthy. Until that night. It was humid out, and as the temperature dropped, there was a little bit of fog. Not enough to really slow me down, but I had to turn off the high beams. So I'm shooting across the bridge, and it hits me that it seems to be taking longer than normal to get across it. Maybe I was just tired? Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me? And then, when I thought I was finally getting to the end of it, I saw a figure walking on the opposite side of the road. At first, it was no big deal, right? Guy is walking in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night. Probably lives nearby, probably drunk. Watch them to make sure they don't fall in front of the car. But my mind is already racing. I mean, this is the middle of nowhere. There are no houses around. There are no lights but the stars, and my headlights are stabbing out in the darkness. And as I was by, going way too fast for my own good, I noticed two things. First, the figure is wearing what appears to be a straitjacket, with the sleeves undone and the straps trailing to the ground. Glaring white against the background of the night, no one is mistaking it. He was in a straitjacket, hands covered, straps dangling, and waving as he walked. Second, it has no face. Not like, there's no head there. There's a head shape. And the place where a face should be, but no face. Just an expanse of darkness that I took to be his skin. I chalked it up to going really fast, the contrast between a white jacket and dark skin at night, and thinking creepy thoughts. I mean, surely I couldn't have just seen that. I tried to spot him in my rearview mirror, but it was so dark that nothing could be seen. I slowed down a little and was suddenly off the end of the bridge and on normal 2-lane blacktop again. I briefly considered turning around and seeing what it was. Surely it was just a trick of the light or my mind playing tricks on me. Right? But I still remember my heart pounding and my fear as I sped on through the darkness, driving home. Between Crown Point, New Mexico, and Borrego Pass on Navajo Tribal Road 48, I am a non-Native American who has lived and worked on the Navajo Indian Reservation as a school teacher on several different occasions. When I first started working at Borrego Pass School in 1997, I was making a home visit to one of my students. His name was Billy. Billy was a very intelligent boy, with a higher than average IQ. He told me on that visit that their neighbor, a mile away, was a skinwalker. I scoffed at Billy and said something like, "There is no such thing." But Billy insisted, saying that the neighbor changed into an animal and came to their house and looked into the windows. This was all very interesting to me, but I pretty much forgot about what he said. Around 1998, I started teaching night classes at Dine College in Crown Point. Teaching astronomy, class would end around 10 p.m., and I would head back home to Borrego Pass, 18 miles to the east. One night after class, about 10:15 p.m., sometime in the spring, April or May, of 2000, I was driving my 1998 Ford Escort on Navajo Tribal Road 48. I drove at about 50 miles per hour because of the possibility of horses and livestock on the roadway. I always noted Billy's house off the road at about the halfway point to my home. It was one of my waypoints. It was about this time that something weird suddenly passed from right to left in front of my car's headlights. This was the strangest creature or object I've ever encountered on the road. It was a large, shapeless hole that did not reflect any light whatsoever. My car's headlights simply disappeared and were swallowed into the darkness of this mass. I saw no definite shape, no legs, no head, no eyes, just a shapeless black hole. I have never seen anything quite like it before or since, but whatever it was, it gave me the creeps. I remember getting scared and speeding up. I pushed the car's speed up to 65 miles per hour and got to my little duplex at Borrego Pass ASAP. I got into the apartment as quickly as possible and locked the door behind me. I then sat in the living room, trying to figure out what I saw. The next day, I told one of my Navajo friends what I saw. His jaw dropped. He immediately said it was a skinwalker. I have told this story to several Navajos, and they have all pretty much come to the same conclusion that it was a skinwalker. Weird stuff, for sure. This one is a doozy and still bothers me to this day. I was in high school at the time, and it was around 1 a.m. on a Saturday night. Me and my best friend were just hanging out playing some League at the crib when we got a call that our friend got too drunk at a party and needed to be picked up. Whatever, we're sober as penguins, and he's gotten us before, so we set out. We pick him up, throw him in the back seat, and begin the journey home. We live kind of out in the country, so it's a bit foggy and there are no other cars on the road. When, all of a sudden, as we come around a turn, do we see this animal thing? A ball of reddish-brown fur just hunched over in the ditch on the side of the road. I thought it was maybe an injured bear or a big-ass wolf, so I slowed down to a crawl and blasted the high beams. This mother ducker proceeds to turn its head and look right at us. Beady little red eyes, pointed ears, and a snout like a wolf. I can't look away from this thing, as our drunken friend is rolling around in the back, completely unaware. This thing then stands up on two legs and turns to face us. It looks like a dead-ass werewolf/vampire mix. Fangs poking out of its mouth. Long, pointed ears. Covered in long, reddish-brown fur that's thinner on its chest and midsection. It's taller than the street sign next to it, and it's still in the ditch. Easily 8 to 9 feet tall. It's lanky as hell, but I can still see some muscle definition. And it's just staring at us. I glance over at my buddy in the passenger seat, and he's sunken way down, shaking, just saying, "Drive, drive, drive. Dude, please just drive. Jake, please. Drive." I turn my head back to decide if I'm going to have to run this thing over. This thing fucking gets down on all fours and bounds across the field next to it at a breakneck pace. And I just sit there, stunned. Samp out of it and drive home. I am wondering if I will go on to be one of those crazy Bigfoot people and spend my life hunting this thing. Nobody ever believes me when I tell the story, but I can still call my buddy up and ask, "WTF did we see that night, dude?" And he immediately knows what I'm talking about. So yeah. And now I spend 90% of my time in forests and outdoors for my job. Always knowing that shit like that really do be out here. I live in a rather populated area of northwest Louisiana, but if you continue down Highway 1 for a while and cross some train tracks, you'll end up in the middle of nowhere with trees on all sides. There are some back roads that I used to drive all the time when I was younger that go through a rather abandoned area with maybe one gas station and a bunch of abandoned buildings. While heading back out of that small town, I was rounding a corner, and my lights hit something on the right side of the road a little ways in front of me. It was tall, pale, had long limbs, yellow eyes like a cat or coyote when you shine a light on it, and it was fast. It's way too fast for a human to move. It darted across the road in front of my car, over a fence, and behind an old building. It was so human, but it wasn't. I instantly got overwhelmed with a feeling of fear, a primal instinct that I can't even begin to describe, but everything in my body was telling me that I wasn't human and to drive faster and get out of there. My eyes started to well with tears. Again, I can't really describe this feeling, but it's something you'd have to feel yourself to understand. I have no idea what this thing was. So my grandpa has this ranch about 25 miles east of Payson, Arizona. For those in Arizona, it's between Hagler Creek and the 260. It's very secluded, but the land is good for grazing. I spend a lot of time running Jersey calves on the range. Every night, one of us rides out to check on the cattle in the field and to check the fence line for holes in the wire. A few days ago, I was riding out to check on the herd at about 1:30 a.m., and I kept hearing rustling in the tree line running along the fence perimeter. I figured it was coyotes or squirrels. I see a lot of them up there. It went away every 10 to 15 minutes, and then I could hear it again. The second time I heard it, I was off my horse and walking him to a little water trough. The cows were about 150 to 200 yards away, just within my view with the moonlight. I heard the rustling again, but this time it was heavy. Me and my horse, Vegas, both looked up at the same time, wondering what the duck we were hearing. At this point, I came to the eerie realization that whatever was out there was tracking me, and Vegas didn't seem so interested in the cows. So in an attempt to scare it off, I got back on my horse and grabbed my whip, uncoiled it. I don't use it on animals, I only use it to make a loud noise to move cattle, and cracked it a few times rather than using my pistol. The rustling stopped, and the forest was dead quiet once more. Not thinking much about it, I went back to count the heads. I marked 38 heads, all the cows were there. So I started my way back to the house. I was about 3.5 miles away. It's a bit of a trail ride to get back. It was about 10 minutes of silence until I heard the rustling again. At this point, I was getting pissed. I figured it was some dumb-ass coyote thinking we were going to lead him somewhere. So I called my grandpa on my radio, there's zero service out there, whatsoever, and told him I was going to fire my gun, so he didn't get worried. So I reached down and pulled my revolver from my side. For all you guys who like firearms, it's a Uberti replica Colt 45 Peacemaker, chambered .45 Colt, and I fired one round into the air. The rustling stopped as the shot rang out through the woods and mountains. My ears rang, and the smell of gunpowder filled my nose as the smoke settled. After I calmed Vegas down, I started riding back. Only for the rustling to come back 5 minutes later. I started getting really nervous at this point because usually coyotes run away when they get scared by a loud noise. I didn't have a flashlight on me because I'm dumb and forgot, so I used my lame-ass phone flashlight and dismounted. I slowly walked to the tree line, where I heard the rustling as I had my gun out, ready for an animal to jump at me or something. I flashed my light around through clearings in the trees. And to my right, I heard rustling about 100 feet away. I turned over, and to my surprise and confusion, I saw a black silhouette of a horse running across the trail. I immediately thought, shit, is that one of our horses? Is that someone else's horse? So I rode over to where I saw the horse, shaking with anxiety. I looked and was confused as to how a horse even ran out of and into the forest because it was so thick with shrubbery. And when I looked back behind me to start riding back, I stopped freezing in fear as I got the chills. I dropped my gun and heard the sound of it hitting the ground echo through the woods, because in front of me, about 50 feet away, was a silhouette of a man wearing a flat brim hat who appeared to have chaps on. I picked up my gun and aimed at the figure, and it was gone. I got back to Vegas and rode like the wind to get out of there, constantly looking behind me in fear of it following. I made it back and told my grandpa. He was trying to calm me down and said he'd had some weird experiences. When I was about 6 or 7, maybe 8, I lived in a small apartment on the first floor. There was only one bedroom, which was filled with stuff, so me and my family all slept in the living room on the sofa that opens up into a bed. I was the one sleeping next to a wall. On the other side of the wall was the kitchen. So pretty much every night I slept there, I got a nightmare, and I always woke up at 3 a.m. and then went to sleep later on. In the nightmares, there was a tall man, I would say about 190 centimeters or 6 foot 2 feet, who always wanted to trap me or hurt me. The one I remember exactly is where me and my grandma were in the house, and it was pouring rain. Suddenly, I remembered that we left our shoes outside. When I opened the door to grab them, there he was, a tall, completely black creature. It looked like a person's shadow. Randomly, there was a trash can next to the door, and he put me in there and locked me inside. At that point, it was 3 a.m., so I woke up. Once my mother tried sleeping on that spot, she also had a nightmare and woke up at 3 a.m. but exactly before we were about to move away, I fell asleep, and in the dream, I kind of woke up, and like a ninja, I jumped out of bed, ready to fight. But as I was searching for him, I saw someone walking out of the kitchen. The kitchen light was randomly on, and it was a tall man with a long beard and long hair. It turns out he just wanted a friend to play with. In the dream, we still agreed to meet up some other time and spend some time together, but I never saw him again. Later, when I was talking to my mother about it, she told me that yes, there was a ghost portal in that apartment and that it was also on the 2nd or 3rd floor. I can't remember exactly. I also forgot to mention that we saw many things get lost in there, like when I would throw a ball on top of the wardrobe, and when I went to look for it, it just didn't exist anymore. Since then, I have always believed in ghosts. I live and work at a mountain resort right across from Huntington Lake in Fresno County, California. The Delta Aquarid meteor shower peaked July 28th to 29th, so on the 29th, I went out to a nice big gravel parking lot, laid down a furniture pad and a pillow, and watched the meteor shower. The parking lot is oblong, stretching into the forest. I went right into the middle of it and got comfy. It was about 11 a.m. when I went outside. I tuned into the forest around me as I was watching the stars. I am very into the outdoors and enjoy listening to the forest. I heard deer, and owls, and bats, and all kinds of normal nighttime forest sounds. I was really keeping my ears out for bears, though, because we've had them in the area, and while I'm not too worried about black bears, they have been getting into our trash and things, and I didn't want to come up with one that wasn't afraid of me. Anyway, after about 45 minutes of silent observation, I heard a loud stomping through the woods. I thought it was a person or two people. It certainly didn't sound like any kind of quadruped, though. It was very close to the edge where the forest meets the parking lot. I thought it was human and assumed it seemed so loud because it was so silent outside. I hollered hello? And heard a very loud, sharp, exhaling type of sound. Kind of like the sound of a bull huffing. And then very fast movement away and slightly along the edge of the adjoining parking lot, veering deeper into the woods. The crashing sound was punctuated by that sharp exhale. It freaked me out a bit because it was moving so fast. There was absolutely no galloping type of movement. There was no light even when it was very close to the edge, which makes me certain it wasn't human. It was a moonless night, or very close to, I can't remember exactly, only that it was perfect for stargazing. I thought it was a bear honestly, but I thought it was really weird that it was so loud and that there wasn't a galloping type of sound despite moving so quickly. I also thought the exhaling sound was strange as I'd never heard a bear make anything like that. But bear was the only thing I could think of being so loud and moving so quickly. Bears are usually pretty stealthy. My folks visited me from out of town and commented on the Sasquatch mural on the 168 going through Shaver Lake, and I had a WTF connecting the dots moment, thinking about the stuffed Sasquatch in Ken's Market. Tonight I decided to look it up, and it seems like there's a lot of reports in the area. I don't know what I heard, and I could easily be wrong about what it was. All I know is I'll be watching the Perseid meteor shower from a lot ducking closer to my house tonight, that's for sure. When I was 10, I was riding my bike home from a friend's house when I encountered a keelet. I live far north, and it was mid-December, so we were about halfway through the 3-month blackout. It was dark 24 hours a day. It was late afternoon, but if it weren't for the streetlights that lined every street, I wouldn't have been able to see a thing. I had to pedal slowly because I was bundled up in not only my heavy clothes but also my windproof coveralls because we were pre-blizzard. I stopped halfway up the hill that led to my street to take a puff of my inhaler and rest my legs. After my breathing slowed, I was able to hear a panting sound behind me. I turned around, expecting to see Petey, the coyote hybrid stray that was basically owned by the entire town. He was super friendly and was known to check on children when they were outside on their own. But Petey wasn't there. I shrugged it off and dismounted my bike. It was easier to walk alongside it at this point. As I was nearing my street, I felt a hot breath on the small bit of ankle that was exposed between my overalls and rolled down socks. Immediately, I stopped and looked around again. I was raised by a very superstitious family. My papa always says that if something seems a little off, then you're not perceptive enough. After a moment of surveying my surroundings, I saw a 4-legged figure trotting up the street behind me. It was too tall to be Petey, but too thin to be a wolf or loose hunting dog, so I began moving again, realizing that it was not an animal I could not predict. I kept my eyes on it and walked slowly, just in case it was a very malnourished wolf that was looking for something to eat. It was only when I turned slowly onto my street that the animal started walking faster. Its movements were so strange, and it made grunting noises that almost sounded human. When it suddenly began running, I pushed my bike back towards it and dashed up the hill towards my house. Our street was essentially a dirt road that turned into our driveway. The dirt was muddy from melted snow, and I kept slipping. Rocks kept my hands from stopping me from hitting the ground, and my tiny ankles kept rolling. At one point, I couldn't catch myself in time, and I ended up sliding a few feet downhill. That's when I felt a searing pain on the back of my left leg. I cried out and rolled over to kick the animal off me. That was when I got a good look at my attacker. It was definitely a canine of some kind. But it didn't have any hair. Its skin looked like black metal under the flickering streetlight overhead. I didn't get a full look at it, though, because I immediately began kicking at it with the leg that wasn't pinned by its paws and teeth. 2 good strikes to its side had it whimpering and jumping back just enough for me to scramble to my feet and begin running again. I could feel blood rolling down my leg as my house came into view. I could still hear the dog growling as it sprinted after me. I screamed for my mom as I approached the front porch, praying that they were home and that their guns were nearby. Aga opened the door less than a moment after hearing my shouts. She says that all she saw was me half running and half crawling up the driveway, and that was all it took for her to run outside in her pajamas and bare feet. She heard a sort of howling noise as she picked me up and ran back up the steps. We got inside just as Katie was running out of the den with her 50-year-old AR-7. The rifle only worked like 40% of the time, but it was the only weapon that wasn't locked up in their bedroom closet. I wrapped my arms and legs around Aga and buried my face in her neck, sobbing violently. She could feel the warm blood from my leg against her back, and she immediately rushed into the kitchen to call Katie's mother, Mary, Grammary, as I called her, who was staying at my Aunt Gloria's house. She's a nurse, and she would be better than any doctor or shaman in the town. Grammary could hear my cries in the receiver and immediately got moving. Gloria, like everyone else in my family, lived on the same property, so it wouldn't take her long. When I was finally cleaned up with a drain put in my wounds, Cal sat down beside me on my parents' bed and asked me to recall everything that happened leading up to the attack. I thought it was just a sickly wolf or coyote who wanted to claim one more victim before going into the woods to die. Pawpaw drew up some sketches for me and asked if any of them looked like the ones that attacked me. When I pointed out the one that most resembled the hairless beast, he immediately kissed the side of my head and hugged me close. In the 1950s, Pawpaw had a friend who went by the name Howdy. He was also an Inuit, and the two of them had basically grown up together. When they were both 15, Pawpaw joined Howdy on a hunting trip about 100 miles north of our property. This took place during the blackout as well. As they trekked through the thick brush of the tundra, Pawpaw could remember seeing Howdy about 5 feet ahead of him. But suddenly, he wasn't there. There was a howl, a scream, and a growl before the overgrowth to Pawpaw's right began to rustle violently. Before he could react, it went silent. He found Howdy's body about 10 yards away from the path. He was mauled and mangled to the point of being unrecognizable. But Pawpaw knew it was his buddy. It took him 2 days to carry Howdy back to his truck so he could drive him home. Throughout this arduous hike, Pawpaw could see large paw prints in the mud ahead of him. Each time he drew closer, they would disappear. When he finally got to the truck and set Howdy up in the bed of it, he saw what he knew was responsible for ending the other man's life. Keelet, something he had only read about, was pacing the edge of the trail, watching Pawpaw with small but piercing eyes. Not unlike the legends of other black dogs, Keelet are large black, and, in this case, hairless, canines that were known to attack travelers and kill them. According to the legends told in our village, it was rare to survive a Keelet encounter, but those who did immediately went mad. As far as I know, I never went mad. Surprisingly, my wound healed in practically no time, and the only thing I had left of the encounter were horrific nightmares and a fear of the blackout. I was driving in the woods years ago. It was a pretty familiar area, and to this day I can drive to the exact spot where it happened. It was summer, and I drive a convertible, so the top was down. Maybe somewhere around 2 a.m.-ish. On the horizon of the right side of my car, I see flashes of amber light in the distance. At first I thought it was an emergency vehicle, but I know the area well, and there was no road where the lights were coming from, nothing but woods for miles. In fact, I almost crashed the car trying to figure out the lights. I have to stop the car and turn around. It's a 2-lane road with no lights nearby whatsoever. Nothing but starlight in my headlights as I turn my car around in the middle of the road. My headlights land on this thing, I guess. Whatever it is, it was at least 8 feet tall. At least, that's my best guess. It was much taller than me at 6 feet. I stopped the car. Why I did so, I couldn't tell you. I don't know myself. But I did, and I shut the lights off, and this thing, which was definitely humanoid and definitely not human, had some sort of luminescence about it. Its skin glows with a dull white light. The thing started to move towards the car and was making terrible noises. Hoarse, moaning noises, that's the best way I can describe the sound it made. As it got closer, I could make out its features. I remember thinking that if it were humans, it would have starved to death long ago. Its arms were out of proportion, as was its neck. They were abnormally long, and its arms were nearly to its knees. It had wrinkled, worn, leathery-looking skin, which was the purest white I had ever seen. The closer it got, I could see more, its eyes, or apparent lack thereof. They just looked like large, deep, dark holes. Its mouth was crooked and way too wide. If it had ears, the corners of the mouth would be right up to them. The moaning, limping, shuffling thing came too close for comfort, and I had seen enough. I started my car and took the Nope train right out of there. I drove 90 all the way home. In hindsight, I regret leaving. I had the strong impression, after the fact, that the thing was injured, sick, or even dying. It did not look well, and whatever it was, I think perhaps it only wanted help. In hindsight, I hoped it had found help, or had at least come to a swift end, as it was obviously suffering. A little bit of background: this was in Southwest Michigan, and myself. I have been employed in the past as a paramilitary contractor, which means I have had plenty of psych evaluations mandatory for the job. I am perfectly sane except for chronic insomnia, and I absolutely do not do drugs other than cigarettes and the very occasional beer. My husband and I are currently in West Virginia, specifically in the Point Pleasant area, for a spooky road trip for a few days. We've done all the expected things: Mothman Museum, visited the TNT bunker at the nature reserve, all the fun, but decided to go up to Parkersburg last night for the heck of it. On our way back to the hotel, we ended up branching off from 77 and taking 2 back to Point Pleasant. It had already gotten dark and had to be around 9 or so when we went around this corner to see this random man leaned up against a guardrail. We were both quite shocked at this. It's super dark out, and the guy appears to have just been standing there, but what really makes us uncomfortable is that as we get up to him, this man smiles. I cannot put into words how unnerving and off-putting this smile was, but there was something a bit uncanny. In my experience, when people smile at strangers, it's usually a small, polite smile, but this was full of teeth and looked unnatural. Obviously we drove on, talked about the strangeness of it all, and my husband chalked it up to a potential druggie, perhaps someone waiting for someone else to pick him up, we thought we were them, etc. Well, today I ended up buying a local and independent mountain monsters coloring book from a store and was flipping through it only to see Indrid Cold as one of the pages. I asked my husband if he knew this one, because he's more knowledgeable about cryptids than me in some aspects, but he didn't. I searched online, and Indrid is also known as the Smiling Man and has apparently been seen all over, from as far as New Jersey. 2 cases in particular caught my attention, though, because 2 of the popular sightings have been in Point Pleasant and Parkersburg, where we were coming from. When I was a kid back in the early 90s, my parents moved us from a city in southern Wisconsin to a dinky rural town in central Wisconsin. Anyway, fast forward to the early 2000s, when I was a teenager, and that's when I saw what I can only describe as a gargoyle. I was a night owl. So staying up during the night was nothing new for me. I'd usually stay up just watching TV or playing a game in my room during the night. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor and only had 1 window. The window gave me a view of the roof, the living room, and the backyard. We had a security light put in the backyard because we had trouble with people coming onto our property, so the light lit up the yard and the whole back of the house. One summer night, I was in my room watching TV, and I was going to move from a sitting position to a laying down one on my bed. My bed was sideways up against the wall that had the window, and the end of my bed was right next to the edge of the window. I could always get a good look out that window when I was lying down. So, as I went to lay down in bed with my head facing the direction of the window, I noticed something very unusual that was perched on the corner of our roof that I could see from my window, watching over our backyard. I didn't get a creeped out feeling from it, I actually felt very calm and peaceful, but there was a sense of shock from seeing it. The creature had gray skin, a rounded head with no hair anywhere on the body, and the wings looked to be of medium size with lighter gray feathers on them. The body was skinny. I didn't really get to look at the arms, as the wings were blocking them from my view, but the legs didn't look very long or short. I also didn't see eyes or other facial features, as the wings kept them hidden, too. I could only see the top part of the head poking up above the wings, the legs, and the wings. Had the creature been standing up, it wouldn't have been much taller than me, and I'm 5 feet 2 inches. I also had my window open that night to feel the cool air. The creature made no sounds at all. I didn't notice any strange smells coming from it either. I have no idea how long it stayed there, as I got bored watching it and went back to watching my movie. I never saw it again after that night, though. When I was 17, we had a family friend who had a camp 40 minutes out into the middle of nowhere, and of course, being myself, I wanted to go and hang out with all my friends near my age. So we went. No cell service, no plumbing, all electricity was solar powered, an outhouse, and all camp on a lake. None of my friends were there, and all the adults went down 3 camps off for drinks, and I was stuck with all the kids 13 and under. Free babysitting, am I right? Anyway, to the point, I had settled in and was reading a book with my flashlight while the kids were watching a movie on their tablet. What's the point of camping if you're on your electronics? And I heard the sound of someone in the driveway, the footsteps on the gravel. I got up from my book and went to see if it was one of the adults from the group, but as soon as I stuck my head out the door, I noticed an awful rotten stench when the sound stopped and there was no one there. I swear, I'd never felt so chilled as I did in that moment. The hair on my neck was raised, and I slammed the door shut loudly and locked it. The next night, when the adults were back, we paired up to go to the outhouse before bed. Of course, myself and the family friend were the last 2 out there. I had done what needed doing and was waiting for my friend. That's when the twigs snapped and the chills were back. I saw movement. A large, dark, almost black dog-like shape was off in the tree line. I froze. It was darting around so fast, I wouldn't have believed the speed if I hadn't seen it. My friend came out of the outhouse, and the latch snapped my attention from it to her. She was concerned about how pale I was, but when I tried to point it out, it was gone. Poof. We went inside, and all throughout the night I could hear howling, barking, and sounds from outside. It reminded me of the whole laughter sound from hyenas. But every so often there was this awful, deep, choppy howl of a sound no coyote could make. It wasn't the scream of a dying rabbit or the laughter from a fox. It was not natural. It was twisted. I tell this because about a month ago I was out with my boyfriend for a light night drive along the coast, off a distance from the city. While he was driving and we were talking, we both saw something massive. It was dark, almost black in color, dog-like in structure, and there was an awful, unforgettable smell in the air. We were both shouting and sped away from it. I convinced him it was just a black bear, but there was no way. It was far too large and thin for a bear in the late summer. I know it was that thing. But anytime I tell someone about it, I'm told I'm crazy. I'm just hearing coyotes, as we don't have wolves in our province. A couple of years ago, 2 friends and I, we'll call them D and J, went to a place called Look Rock. It's a concrete observation tower at the top of Chilowee Mountain in Blount County, Tennessee. To get to the tower, you park in a small pull-off, then walk a paved trail half a mile up the mountain. I've been up to this tower many times, and there's usually some kind of energy in the air. You can't see it, but you can feel it. It's like the woods themselves have acquired sentience, and they're just barely tolerating your presence. Anyway, this particular trip was eerily quiet. This night was silent. Going back to my simile, it's like the sentient woods were terrified of something and were paralyzed with fear. The trip up the mountain was uneventful. We went up to the tower and shot the proverbial shit for a couple of hours. Finally, around 3-ish, we decided it was time to wrap it up. We began the trip back down. At the base of the tower, there's a couple of flattish boulders, about 6 feet or so in diameter, placed as a decoration. What I saw on the boulder was the start of a terrifying night. Nobody else in my group noticed, but squatting on the boulder was a solid black form, about 4 to 5 feet tall, with deeply glowing red eyes. It stared at us for a second, then vanished into thin air. Assuming my eyes were just ducking with me, I reluctantly carried on past the boulders. The feeling of uneasiness followed us up until about the 30% point. On this trail, there's a point where the trail turns 90 degrees to the right, when going back down. The trail you're walking on continues forward, but it's just an ATV access for the rangers. This is in Smoky Mountain National Park. About 20 feet or so before the turn, I notice an extra pair of footsteps. There were only 3 of us, but 4 sets of footsteps. I stopped and looked, and right behind Jay was a 7-foot tallish heat distortion, like when you look over a flaming grill on a summer day. It was vaguely human-shaped. As with the form on the boulder, after looking at it for a few seconds, it vanished. At this point, we double-timed it back to the car. They hadn't seen it, but they felt it. Halfway down the trail, there's a spot where one tree has fallen into the split trunk of another tree, so it forms kind of a triangle against the ground. At the top of the triangle, the same crouched black form has deep red eyes. Again, it vanished after looking at it. We made it back down to the truck, everything in our minds screaming run. We did about 90 down Foothills Parkway until we made it back to the highway. From there, the trip was uneventful. We dropped Jay off at his house and proceeded to Dee's house, about 15 minutes away. As I was pulling out of Dee's driveway, his phone rang. He answered it, turned pale, and flagged me down. Something had happened at Jay's house. We booked it back to Jay's, where we found every light in his house on. We went in and found him in bed, with a Bible in one hand and A.45 in the other. Jay's bedroom faces a streetlight. Also, in his room, he has a nightlight, a clock, and a stereo, all of which keep his room fairly well lit. He went to bed, and then the room suddenly went dark. He could still see the streetlight, the clock, the stereo, etc., and they were still there, but they cast no glow into the room. He said he couldn't even see his hand in front of his face. He went on to say that something had put its hand on his throat and growled in his face, then left. By the time we got there, it had already left. Just to be sure, we lined the doors and windows with salt. I had read somewhere that salt kept stuff away. We never heard from the thing again. To this day, I have no idea what it was, but it's what I picture when someone uses the word imp. We've been back to the tower several times since, but it's never been the same. The woods have always seemed quiet and afraid. So I was 10 when this happened, and it was the middle of the night. My Great Dane Annie had to go use that bathroom, so I let her out back and waited by the door because it was very cold that night. I waited for a good 10 minutes before I started to hear her barking, which she never doesn't. So I started to get a little worried, and like a dumbass, I got my jacket from my room and went to get her. Now to lay out my backyard, we have an off-ground porch and half an acre of land that is cleared off except for the back half, which has lots of trees. Then there is the fencing, which, if jumped, leads to the mountains. I crossed my arms and called her name a few times. She was a black dog, so it was hard to see her, but she whined and rushed back to me, almost knocking me off my feet. She stood in front of me defensively, which she had never done before or after this night. She was growling deeply and put all of her weight against me. I petted her, trying to calm her down. She looked down at one of the open porches, which was probably 4 to 5 feet of ground. She was barking like crazy, to the point of spitting out of her mouth. I had never seen anything like this, and this is when I put my old phone out and turned the flashlight on, thinking I might see a rat or maybe something else. There was a face that was slim and had huge black eyes and a smirk. I couldn't remember the skin tone, but I want to say it was either gray or light brown. It had hair, which I think was blonde, and it was kind of slicked back. It didn't look human. I screamed and quickly fell back, dropping my phone. I was about 6 feet away from the door, and once I got back up, I ran towards it and screamed for my dog. I heard a second whine, and when she rushed back to me, she had a slash over her neck. I slammed the door and locked it. I started crying like crazy. This is when my mom came down the hall shaking and had her pistol with her. Please note that we live in a very rural area and my dad works nights. She asked what happened, and I told her. She told me I was seeing things in the darkness and tried to tell me that Annie probably got into a fight with a raccoon. I didn't sleep that night or a few nights after that. We took Annie to the vet the next day, and they had no idea what caused her wound. They asked if anyone would try to kill her. We said no. A few weeks later, I saw it again, but I remember this event way better, probably because I had nightmares about it for about a week. It was around 5 this time. I had woken up early because I and my family were going on a trip. I had gotten up to get some milk to try to get 1 extra hour of sleep. At first, everything was normal before I heard tapping at the kitchen window. My blood went very cold, and it was so dark that I couldn't see what was at the window at first, even with the light on. I stood there with it taped for a few more seconds before just placing my hand in the window. It looked to be about my size, which is kind of small since I was only like 5 feet at the time. I started to shake and slowly walked out of the kitchen, keeping the light on and my eyes on the window. Suddenly, it punched the window, making it crack, and screamed. I ran back into my room, locked the door, and screamed that it was coming for me and my little sister, whom I shared a room with. I hid under my blankets crying, and I fell back asleep for a little bit. Somehow no one heard me that time, and I never told anyone about what had happened that night. Of course, as we were leaving, something had to do with the window, but he just thought it was because it was old, and we replaced it once we got back. I worked a night shift as a carer. Around 3 a.m., we got a phone call from the 4th floor. The guy said his neighbor was yelling. That falls on me to investigate. I'm a big guy. Nothing should intimidate me. Right? I get on the elevator and head towards the 4th floor. As soon as I pass the 2nd floor, I hear this inhuman wailing sound. It was like, straight up from a horror video game or a movie. The wailing and screeching got louder and louder as I got closer. I've hit the 4th floor. Immediately as the doors open, there she is. Wispy hair. 70 pounds and a wild, crazed look in her eyes. She immediately made contact with me and stared into my soul. I stepped off, and she was still wailing and slamming her walker around. I felt like she was going to be combative. I gave her a wide berth and very calmly talked to her. I was able to get her turned around, and she followed me back to her room. This entire time, she has not said anything intelligible and is full of hysteria. It's a nightmare. I'm trying to calm her down as we are walking. Halfway back to her room, I hear silence for the first time. I turn around, and she is completely still. She very carefully lifts up her arm and shakily points a finger at me. Watch out for the man behind you. Then back to screeching and banging her walker around. Bricks shat. I'm done. Let's go to your room. No one was behind me. And the entire rest of the trip, I felt a very eerie presence. Something sinister is watching me. I took the lady back to her room. I took her to the bathroom. I cleaned her up. I tucked her into bed. I went back downstairs, completely terrified. This story happened about 4 years ago. I'm in my late 20s, and so is my friend. It was around June, in Toowoomba, Australia. My friend, let's call him Mark, asked me to come pick him up from his college in the Downlands. June is when it gets its coldest in Toowoomba, and that night I remember it reaching 4°C/25°F. It was around 6:30 when I reached the college. Mark is a teacher there, and apparently his car had stopped working. I wandered through the dark, trying to find the admin block. I finally reached the block, and Mark was inside. He looked shaken up. I asked him what happened. He said in a shaky voice, "He's here, a ghost, we're at the school too late. He's been moving stuff." As you can imagine, at this point, I started to absolutely freak out. Downlands is a boarding school, so I knew there were a small number of people still here. However, the boarding block and admin block are far, far apart. And I was not about to wander through the dark pathways, with Mark spouting the stuff he was. Instead, I decided to go back to the car with him. So we locked up the office and cautiously walked out. As we were blindly walking the concrete path in our thick jumpers, the wind was making an eerie howling noise as it started to blow gusts. Then I saw a flickering light, an orange light, coming from behind us. All of a sudden it got really warm, and I mean a quick, sudden boost in temperature. We were about halfway down this hill, so Mark and I turned around to see what was at the top of the hill. This still freaks me out when I think of it. It was a man on fire. He was standing there watching us, and when we turned around, he stared at us for about 5 seconds. It felt like 5 hours then. He then let out the most horrendous scream and started to run at us. Mark and I ran and fell over to the side of the path. The man on fire ran past us, down the hill, and into the forest. I got up, looked down towards the oval, and he was still running. He just came out of the forest and was running towards a road, until he and the fire vanished. At that point, we decided to run to the boarding block and find another member of the faculty. We reached the block, and we found one of Mark's colleagues. He let us stay the night. We were told it's a common thing to see if you stay in the admin block too late or if you're walking those paths at that time of night. Even from this block, everyone can hear his screams at least once a week as he terrorizes the school grounds at night. Apparently, the faculty member, who was also a teacher, said he had only seen the burning man once. When I asked Mark the next morning what he had seen in the admin block, he replied, "All the drawers started to open, and I heard a voice say, 'The fire has been lit.' When I first started to work here, the office ladies warned me that I shouldn't stay late near the building. Now I know why." Before we left the next morning, we went to the admin block and asked the office ladies if they had ever seen him. We went in and saw a younger lady in her 30s. She asked, "Do you have an appointment, Mark?" "No, but we just wanted to ask if you had ever seen." Then an older lady, maybe late 60s or early 70s, came out from the back and said, "You too saw the burning man, didn't you?" Mark replied, "Yes, we did, we saw him last night." The old woman came closer and said, "Yes, all the drawers were open. I've seen him many times, it's not a pleasant experience. Try not to stay late, if you do, don't come anywhere near this building." The younger lady spoke up, "I've seen him twice, I hated it, I've never stayed late again." We both left, and Mark got the day off. I never stepped foot on those school grounds again. The burning man at Downlands College has been noted as one of Toowoomba's most menacing paranormal experiences.